Hi, I'm David Rohde. I'm a columnist at Reuters, and my new book is called Beyond War, Reimagining American Influence in a New Middle East. You can look at one aspect of my background, and yes, it's very negative. I was kidnapped and held captive for 7 months by the Taliban, but I'm sitting here today because more moderate Afghans and Pakistanis, one Afghan that was kidnapped with me, helped me escape. And then we made it to a Pakistani military base, and a moderate Pakistani army captain led us on that base, let me call home. So the kidnapping, in a way, it showed me the best in the region, the people who helped me escape, and then the worst in the region in terms of these extremists. And I do think there's this sort of historic struggle going on now. A lot of people see just chaos in the Middle East. I see a struggle for control between sort of very conservative Islamists, some of them are violent, not all of them, and then sort of more liberal, more tolerant Muslims. And it's this really important struggle that I think is going to impact the region in the region and the world for decades. I guess one of the things that struck me was how thoroughly sort of indoctrinated some of the young men I met, and how much they sort of believed that there was this vast, international conspiracy by Christians and Hindus and Jews to obliterate Islam from the face of the earth. They thought the 9/11 attacks were staged. They believed that Afghan women were being forced to work as prostitutes on U.S. military bases, and they believed that U.S. soldiers were forcibly converting Afghans to Christianity. So they kind of saw themselves as using desperate measures to defend themselves from this, hugely oppressive foreign effort to eliminate their faith and their culture and their sort of way of life from the face of the earth. There are extremists. I think there's very few of them, but there are also 2.5 million at least Muslims living in the U.S. And what happened in Boston's a tragedy. But I think what extremists want us to do is turn this into a sort of religious conflict, and they want us to kind of stereotype all Muslims and discriminate against all Muslims. I mean, this is what my guards were constantly told, was that it was all about kind of anti-Muslim bigotry. So we should be vigilant, aggressive law enforcement, but where there are kind of community leaders in the U.S. that are working with U.S. officials, and I think there are many of them, we should support them. We should talk to Muslim Americans and say, what is the government doing right that helps you kind of see if young men are heading in this direction? Is there too much law enforcement? Is there too little? How can we work with you? And it's very, very hard in the wake of something like Boston to ask people to do this, but to not, see the entire group, see the struggle within the group, see the sort of good members of the community and the bad members of the community. And again, I know it's a lot to ask, but I think that's a more effective approach in the long term than sort of saying, all Muslims are somehow, enemies. That's just not true, and it's not productive. I have a bias because of my experiences, the kidnapping that was mentioned. And one group, the negative group that I see on the side of this, and a group that I'm biased against, would have been, my guards when I was kidnapped. During the 7 months I was in captivity, I got to know these guys fairly well. They rotated during the 7 months, but they all had, several things in common. Again, this would be the sort of more conservative, more radical side in the Middle East that by no means represents the majority, but it's the one that you see and hear about on the news the most. So when I was in captivity, most of my guards were Afghan men. They were in their late 20s or early 30s. All had very limited educations from government or religious schools. Many had gone to madrasas. Some didn't make it past high school, and none of them had seen the world beyond Afghanistan and Pakistan. There was one guard in particular who I lived with for 6 weeks, and he was preparing to be a suicide bomber. And I had many conversations with him about why he was preparing for this mission. He was a young man in his 20s, sort of slim with brown hair and brown eyes, and he said he had studied engineering in high school. But years later, he was in the tribal areas of Pakistan, assigned to guard me and preparing for his suicide bombing. He was, frankly, better educated than many of the other guards. There were other guards that could barely read, but he had gone to high school and planned to go to college at one point. And I finally asked him after a few days with him, why did he want to die? Why did he want to be a suicide bomber? And he answered to me that living in this world was a burden for any true Muslim, and that his real goal in life was to die and go to heaven. He said earthly relationships with his parents and his siblings didn't matter to him. And what was interesting is he was so well educated that we were able to speak in English, and he was sort of puzzled by me, and he was puzzled by the West, and he, like many of my other guards, was absolutely convinced that the 9/11 attacks were staged and that there was a worldwide conspiracy by Christians and Hindus and Jews to obliterate Islam from the face of the earth. And they absolutely believed it. They absolutely watched these videos that kept showing evidence of this. And I think, and we can talk about it, I think this is potentially, we don't know what happened in Boston, but potentially this world that these young men were lured into. But they really felt sort of helpless, that there was this worldwide conspiracy. They had no way to stop it, and they were defending their faith and their culture and their way of life from this foreign assault. And he asked me questions during the time we spent together, and one of his questions was he wanted to know if it was true that a necktie like the one I'm wearing tonight was a secret symbol of Christianity. He believed that, as he saw Afghans on local TV stations, government officials dressed in Western clothes, that they were being forced to dress that way, and this was some sign that they were part of this Christian conspiracy. He'd also believed that we Westerners were very weak, and we only cared about the pleasures of this world. I said that I miss my family, and he seemed sort of amused by it. Again, he had been brainwashed systematically to not miss his family, that his relationship with his family did not matter. That's a clear kind of process, and it takes a long time to brainwash these kids into becoming suicide bombers. But a key thing was severing his ties to his family. And I was treated well throughout my captivity, and one of the most remarkable things about him was that I was brought newspapers to read by my guards. They treated me fairly well, and they brought me English language Pakistani newspapers. And this is, again, the sort of more moderate side of Pakistan. These newspapers would have ads on them for mobile phone companies in Pakistan, shampoo, and the ads would actually show pictures of Pakistani women with no scarves on their heads, and it would show their hair. And after I would read the papers and get rid of them, this suicide bomber in training would go burn them, because he felt that having these images sort of in the living area where we were was a sin, and that if he didn't act quickly enough to burn them and get them out of our house, he himself was going to go to hell. So that's the sort of level of, frankly, despair and fear that these young guys feel, that if they don't, pray properly, if they aren't humble enough towards God, they're going to go through hell. And this is the thing they read all the time. And it was really dark and depressing. Another side of all this, and this is sort of the second half, well, it's not the second half of my book, but is another way of looking at all this. I want to talk about some of the characters that are in the book that represent a different side of a very diverse region. And again, I apologize because this is sort of all somewhat simplistic. I want to talk about a Pakistani American named Monis Rahman. He's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. He went out and worked in Silicon Valley for a few years, but decided he really wanted to, test himself. So he went, got some seed capital from the owners of different Silicon Valley companies, and went back to Pakistan and started what became that country's version of Monster.com. And he also started Pakistan's first dating website. It's now the most popular website in Pakistan, and Monis Rahman is sort of one of the most successful businessmen in Pakistan. Similar thing happened with another character in the book, Bülent Çelebi, a Turkish engineer who worked again in Silicon Valley for a few years. He went home back to Turkey, and he noticed something, that the Wi-Fi systems made in the United States, made by Cisco, they didn't work very well in Turkey because the walls are very thick in Turkish homes. And he initially tried to attract American firms to sort of change the equipment, make it stronger so it would work with through the walls in Turkey. They wouldn't listen to him. So in 2004, he started a company called AirTies. And today it's one of the largest tech companies in Turkey. He's expanded this system sort of across the Middle East, beating Cisco at its own game. And he's again an example of this sort of new, more forward-looking business class that's emerged in the region. The last person is a Tunisian. His name is Adel Tourjman, And I was shocked. I was in Tunis last year. Tunis is a safe country. I want to, for the record, state that I did not go to a war zone. And there was this brand new sort of sparkling tower there. And Adele Torjman is the manager of a company called SunGard. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're an American software company. They've got about 17,000 employees worldwide. They specialize in doing back office things. They've got offices in India, and that tower I went into was a joint tower built by SunGard and Hewlett-Packard. And in the SunGard side of that building are 500 Tunisians. When you call for help, I guess you get maybe operators in India, and it frustrates you. What Adele Torjman is doing in SunGard is Tunisians speak French, particularly well-educated ones. And what they're doing is back office work in Tunisia for French consumers. And they're doing very well. So if you're calling a helpline in France, you're very likely to get an operator in Tunisia who will then help you with whatever your concerns are for whatever company. They also write software there. And, you know, Adele Torjman's dream is that Tunisia will sort of be like an India, an outsourcing hub in the Middle East. They're closer to France in terms of time zone, and he feels like they can compete with India in terms of that their wages are much lower. This is sort of the other side, and that sort of growing modern side of the Middle East that I think is representative of a different side of the region.